The coffee was still hot when my son's brother-in-law walked through my front door without knocking. I remember that detail clearly, the steam rising from my cup, the way the morning light cut through the kitchen window, and the sound of boots on hardwood that didn't belong to anyone who lived in this house. I didn't say a word. I just watched him cross the threshold like he owned the place, looked around my living room the way a man appraises property he's thinking of buying, and then turned to me with that smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes. My name is Walter Cole. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working for the Internal Revenue Service, the last 14 as a senior criminal investigator. I've sat across from men worth hundreds of millions of dollars and watched them sweat through their shirts. I've dismantled shell companies built by people who thought they were untouchable. I know how financial fraud smells before anyone's filed a single form. But that morning, I was just a grandfather drinking coffee in his kitchen. His name was Derek Harmon. He was married to my son's wife's older sister, which made him family in the loosest possible sense of the word. He was 44, tall, and had the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered to him. He ran what he called a private equity consulting firm out of a glass office downtown, drove a car that cost more than most people's first homes, and had a habit of reminding everyone in the room how much things cost. My son Daniel had married a good woman named Claire 3 years earlier. Claire's family was large and loud and mostly warm. Her mother, Patricia, was one of the kindest people I'd ever met. But Derek was Patricia's son-in-law too, married to Claire's sister, Vanessa, and from the first time I met him at Daniel and Claire's wedding rehearsal dinner, something about him sat wrong with me. I couldn't name it then. I just filed it away the way I'd learned to file things over 31 years quietly, without making a fuss. I first started to understand what kind of man Derek was on a Tuesday evening about 2 years after the wedding. Daniel and Claire had invited both families over for a birthday dinner for my granddaughter Lily, who was turning 7. Lily was Daniel's whole heart. She was a quiet kid, thoughtful, the kind of child who still believed that if she pressed a flower carefully enough between the pages of a book, she could keep it forever. She had a collection of them, little pressed flowers, in an old notebook she carried everywhere. Roses from the backyard, dandelions from the park, a purple one she'd found on a walk with me that she said looked like a tiny crown. That evening she'd brought the notebook to the dinner table, the way she always did, because she wanted to show me a new flower she'd added that week. A yellow one. She said it was a buttercup, and that she'd found it near the fence at school. Derek looked at the notebook, looked at Lily, and laughed. Not a kind laugh. The kind that comes with a small shake of the head, like something is slightly embarrassing. "You're still carrying that around?" he said. "You're 7, not 4. That's baby stuff." Lily's face didn't crumble. She was too well raised for that, but her hand moved to close the notebook, and she set it on her lap, out of sight, and she didn't take it back out again for the rest of the evening. She didn't show me the buttercup, and when I looked across the table at her, she gave me the smallest smile, the kind that children give when they're pretending something didn't hurt. I looked at Derek. He'd already moved on, talking to someone else, perfectly relaxed. I didn't say anything. Not then. I set down my fork and I watched him, and I thought, I see you. The incidents after that were small, the way these things often are at first. Derek had opinions about everything, and he shared them freely about how Daniel should be further along in his career by now, about how the neighborhood where Daniel and Claire had bought their house was fine for a starter situation, about how Claire's cooking was safe. Always delivered lightly, always with a smile, always in a tone that made you feel like you were overreacting if it bothered you. He was the kind of man who had refined the art of the cutting remark to the point where he could leave a bruise and then look baffled when you said it hurt. Daniel, who loved his wife and therefore loved keeping peace with her family, laughed most of it off. Claire, who'd grown up with Derek as part of her extended family landscape, had learned to navigate around him the way you navigate around a piece of furniture you've stopped noticing. Neither of them wanted to make things hard. I understood that. I said nothing. I watched. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was a Saturday in March. Daniel and Claire had taken Lily to a birthday party, and Derek and Vanessa had stopped by their house apparently with a key. Vanessa had to drop off some item of Patricia's that needed storage. I happened to be there because I'd come over to fix a leak under the kitchen sink. A practical reason. An ordinary Saturday. Derek didn't know I was in the house when he walked in. I was under the sink, so I could hear but not be seen. I heard him walk through the door, heard Vanessa set something down, and then heard Lily's voice, because Lily had stayed home from the party with a small cold, and the babysitter had stepped out briefly to the car. "Where is everybody?" Derek's voice. Lily explained. There was a pause. Then Derek said, in a different kind of voice, quieter, not the company voice, "Your dad's going to have to do something about this place eventually. It's embarrassing." Lily said she liked their house. "You don't know what a good house looks like yet," he said. Another pause. Then, "Where's that flower book of yours? Still doing that?" Lily must have nodded. "You know your dad didn't buy you that," Derek said. "Some old notebook. Your grandfather gave you that. You should have real things, not hand-me-down junk." I stopped moving under the sink. I lay perfectly still on the kitchen floor, and I listened to a grown man speak to a 7-year-old child about her grandfather's gift and call it junk. I listened to Lily go quiet. I listened to Derek move into the other room like he'd said nothing of consequence at all. I drove home that afternoon, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Then I started to remember things. Small things mostly. The way Derek always spoke about his business in vague, impressive terms. Lots of words, not many specifics. The way he'd casually mentioned offshore accounts once at a family dinner, then smoothed past it when someone asked a follow-up question. The way he drove a different car every few months. The way Vanessa had let slip once that they'd had a complicated year financially but somehow emerged with a larger house. The way Derek always paid for things in cash, at family events, restaurants, gifts, and made a small show of it. "Cash is king," he'd say, like it was a philosophy. I am a man who spent 14 years investigating financial crimes. I know what these things look like when they're lined up in a row. I didn't rush. I never rush. Rushing is how investigators make mistakes. Instead, I started paying attention in a more deliberate way. I listened at family gatherings. I remembered what was said and what was conspicuously not said. I looked up his company publicly available information, nothing improper, and found an address, a sparse website, no verifiable client list, and a business registration that had been quietly amended 3 times in 4 years. These are not, by themselves, evidence of anything, but they are notes in a song I had heard before. Over the following weeks, I made a few phone calls to people I still knew, retired colleagues, a former assistant U.S. attorney I'd worked with on a case in 2009, a compliance officer at a regional bank who owed me a professional courtesy. I asked general questions. I framed them generally. What I learned was not specific enough to act on, but it was enough to confirm the shape of what I was looking at. Then Daniel called me on a Wednesday night, and his voice had something in it I hadn't heard since he was a boy and had broken a neighbor's window with a baseball and didn't know how to tell me. "Dad," he said, "I need to talk to you about something." He came over the next morning. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd watched the steam rise from my coffee the morning. Derek walked into my house without knocking, and he told me that Derek had approached him 2 weeks ago with an investment opportunity, a private fund, excellent returns, exclusive access, but Derek was willing to bring Daniel in as a family favor. The minimum investment was $40,000. Daniel had nearly said yes. He'd been close. He'd actually pulled up his savings account to look at the numbers, and then Claire, who'd been listening from the other room, had walked in and said, "Something feels wrong. Call your father first." I loved Claire for that. I still do. I asked Daniel to tell me everything he remembered about what Derek had said. Every detail. Daniel talked for almost an hour. I asked questions. I took notes on the same yellow legal pad I'd used for 31 years because old habits don't retire even when you do. When Daniel finished, I set down my pen and I looked at my son across the kitchen table. "Don't invest," I said. "Don't give him any reason to know you considered it. Just tell him you looked at your finances and the timing doesn't work right now." "Dad, what do you know?" "I know enough," I said. "Give me a little time." Daniel looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. He'd learned by the time he was 12 that when I said, "Give me a little time," I meant I already had a plan and would execute it more effectively without explaining it first. What I did next was careful. It was deliberate, and it was entirely within my rights as a private citizen who had spent 3 decades learning exactly which doors to knock on. First, I drafted a detailed written summary of my observations, the vague business structure, the irregular cash patterns, the amended registration history, the nature of the investment solicitation to my son, and the various small inconsistencies I'd cataloged over 2 years of family gatherings. I was precise. I used the language of someone who knows how these documents are read, and by whom. Then I called a former colleague at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Not to pull strings, I was retired. I had no authority. I wouldn't have wanted any. I called because I knew how to get a concern into the right hands without it being dismissed as a family dispute. There's a difference between walking up to a counter and making a complaint, and knowing which back hallway leads to the person whose job it is to care about exactly this kind of thing. I knew the back hallway. Then I waited. I want to be honest about the waiting, because it was not dramatic. There was no moment where I folded my arms and watched from a distance as everything unfolded in real time. Life is not like that. Investigations take months. Normal life continues. There were more family dinners. I sat across from Derek at 2 of them, once at Patricia's house for Easter, once at a restaurant for Vanessa's birthday, and I watched him the way I used to watch subjects across conference tables. Relaxed. Present. Giving nothing away. Derek, for his part, continued to be exactly who he'd always been. He made a comment at Easter about Daniel's car needing an upgrade. He made a comment at Vanessa's birthday dinner about the neighborhood where Daniel and Claire lived. Still fine for what it is, apparently. He looked at Lily's flower notebook, which she'd quietly brought out to show me her latest edition, and said nothing this time. But the look he gave it was enough. I watched Lily tuck the notebook back into her bag without being asked. She was 8 by then, and she had already learned to make herself smaller around certain people. That is the particular harm men like Derek do that never shows up in any financial statement, the way they teach children early that the things they love are not worth much. I noted it. I said nothing. I drank my coffee. Approximately 4 months after I made my call, I received a phone call from a number I recognized, a 202 area code, a specific prefix. The person on the other end introduced himself and told me that my written summary had been found credible and had contributed to an existing inquiry that had been opened through a separate channel. He thanked me. He asked one follow-up question, which I answered. He told me I would likely not hear more through official channels, which I understood and accepted. That is how these things work. You plant, you don't harvest. 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, Derek Harmon's office was visited by federal agents. I was not there. I didn't need to be. I was in my kitchen, drinking coffee. What came out over the following months was significant. The private fund he'd been pitching to Daniel, and to at least 11 other individuals, including several of Vanessa's colleagues and 2 members of his own family, was not registered. The returns he'd promised existed only on documents he'd generated himself. The offshore structures he'd been using to move money through were layered enough to suggest experience, but not experience quite sufficient for the investigators who'd been watching him. The total amount involved was later reported in court documents at just over $2.3 million. He was indicted on 8 counts, including wire fraud and securities fraud. His assets were frozen pending trial. I found out about the office visit from Daniel, who'd gotten a call from Claire, who'd gotten a call from a stunned Vanessa. Daniel called me immediately. His voice had something in it that was complicated, relief and discomfort, and a kind of awe that a son sometimes feels when he realizes his father is not quite who he thought he was, in a way that matters. "Dad," he said, was this you?" I reported a concern through appropriate channels, I said. Investigators do their own work. But you knew. I suspected, I said. There's a difference. The investigators confirmed. A long silence. He almost had me, Daniel said quietly. $40,000, Dad. That was Lily's college fund. I know, I said. That's why I made the call. The trial took time, as trials do. Derek hired an excellent attorney, which surprised no one who knew him. He entered a not guilty plea and maintained it for several months before changing it. He was ultimately sentenced to 6 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to all identified victims. Vanessa filed for divorce 3 months before sentencing. Patricia, who had not known, who genuinely had not known, Sat with Claire and Daniel in a restaurant booth one evening and cried for about 40 minutes straight. I sat with them and I didn't say anything because sometimes there's nothing to say. The hardest part, the part that I think about most, was not Derek. People like Derek are who they are, and consequences find them eventually or they don't. The harder part was what it did to the people around him. Vanessa, who had to rebuild from a foundation she hadn't known was hollow. Patricia, who had welcomed him into her family and now had to reorganize her understanding of years of her own life. And Claire, who had never quite trusted him but had also never quite distrusted him enough to protect herself from the discomfort of being proven right. And Lily. About a month after the sentencing, I was sitting with Lily at my kitchen table. She was working on a drawing, and I was reading, and we were doing what we'd always done best, which was be in the same room without needing to perform anything. She had her flower notebook next to her on the table. She'd never stopped carrying it. She'd just stopped taking it out around certain people. She picked it up, opened it to a page near the middle, and slid it across the table to me without saying anything. A small dried flower, pale blue, pressed between the pages. A forget-me-not. I found it at the park, she said, last week. I was going to show you at Easter, but I forgot. It's my favorite one so far. It's beautiful, I said. And I meant it. She pulled the notebook back, looked at it for a moment, and then looked at me with the particular directness that children have before they learn to soften their questions for social comfort. Grandpa, she said, Derek's gone now, right? He's not coming to things anymore? No, I said, he's not. She nodded slowly, the way she did when she was processing something she'd already half understood for a long time. Then she went back to her drawing, and her hand was easy on the page, and she didn't look small anymore. She looked, I thought, like herself. That is what I want to say to anyone who is watching this and recognizes something in this story, any part of it. It doesn't have to be fraud. It doesn't have to be federal charges. Maybe it's a person who walks into rooms like they own them and speaks to children in ways that teach those children to hide the things they love. Maybe it's someone who looks at what your family has built and calls it fine for what it is, over and over and over, until the people you love start to believe it. You are allowed to pay attention. You are allowed to know what you know. And if you have tools, whatever your tools are, wherever you gathered them from, you are allowed to use them. I spent 31 years learning how to follow a thread without pulling it too hard, too fast. I did not take the law into my own hands. I handed what I knew to the people whose hands it belonged in. That is the right way to do it. That has always been the right way to do it. My name is Walter Cole. I am 67 years old. I am a retired IRS criminal investigator. I am a father and a grandfather. I drove a city bus for 2 summers in my 20s to pay for my accounting degree, and I have been called many things in my life. Honest, thorough, patient, quiet. Derek Harmon called me nobody. He said it to a 7-year-old child, about a notebook I gave her, in a house he didn't own, on a Saturday when he didn't know I was there. I didn't correct him that day. I let the work do that instead.